For the first time in decades, the United States just launched airstrikes on a sovereign nation in its own hemisphere. Not to stop a terrorist attack, not to rescue hostages, but as part of a pressure campaign that's been building for months. Here's what just happened in Caracas and why it changes everything. At 1:50 a.m. on January 3rd, explosions lit up Venezuela's capital as CNN reporters witnessed windows shaking and the city plunging into darkness. Within hours, a U.S. official confirmed American forces had struck Fort Tiuna and La Carlota Air Base, Venezuela's military headquarters and primary air defense installation. This wasn't another drug interdiction operation in international waters. This was the moment months of naval buildup, oil seizures, and escalating threats finally crossed into open warfare. The Trump administration calls it counter-narcotics. The evidence suggests something far more complex, a shadow war that just became very real. To understand how we reach this breaking point, we need to trace the steady escalation that began the moment Trump returned to office. Within weeks of his inauguration, the Pentagon announced Operation Southern Spear, deploying thousands of troops and multiple naval vessels to the Caribbean under the banner of combating drug trafficking. But the scale told a different story. This wasn't a typical interdiction mission. The USS Gravely, along with destroyers and support vessels, established what military analysts described as a de facto blockade around Venezuelan waters. By September, U.S. forces were conducting daily patrols, intercepting boats and building the largest American military presence in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first major escalation came in October when Trump authorized the CIA to operate inside Venezuela, a significant expansion beyond traditional intelligence gathering. According to sources familiar with the operation, this wasn't just about collecting information. The CIA was given authority to conduct direct action missions against what the administration termed narco-terrorist infrastructure. December brought the economic stranglehold. The U.S. seized 2 Venezuelan oil tankers in international waters, with Trump announcing a total and complete blockade on all sanctioned vessels entering or leaving Venezuelan ports. This wasn't symbolic pressure, it was an attempt to cut off Venezuela's economic lifeline entirely. The pattern was clear. Each step built toward military confrontation while maintaining plausible deniability. Boat interdictions in international waters escalated to seizing oil tankers. Intelligence operations expanded to direct action missions. Economic sanctions transformed into naval blockades. The strikes on alleged drug smuggling vessels told their own story. Since September, U.S. forces conducted over 30 separate attacks, killing more than 100 people in what officials described as counter-narcotics operations. But these weren't small-time smugglers in speedboats. Intelligence reports suggested some vessels belonged to organized networks with potential government connections. The December 29th CIA drone strike on a Venezuelan docking facility marked the crucial turning point. For the first time, American forces hit a land target on Venezuelan soil. Trump confirmed the attack publicly, claiming the facility was used to load up drug boats. But satellite imagery showed the target was a commercial port with mixed-use infrastructure, hardly the clandestine drug operation described in official statements. Maduro's response revealed the regime's desperation. Just days before the Caracas strikes, Venezuela offered to negotiate drug trafficking agreements with the United States, a remarkable concession from a government that had spent years denying any involvement in narcotics trade. The timing wasn't coincidental. Venezuelan officials clearly recognized the military pressure was building towards something bigger. The naval buildup provided the infrastructure for sustained operations. U.S. forces established forward operating bases in Trinidad and Tobago, Puerto Rico, and other Caribbean islands. Military contractors arrived to support extended deployments. Intelligence assets were positioned to provide real-time targeting data for Venezuelan military installations. Each escalation tested international boundaries while providing legal cover. Interdicting boats in international waters fell within maritime law. Seizing sanctioned vessels had economic justification. Even the CIA drone strike could be framed as targeting criminal infrastructure rather than sovereign territory. But the Caracas airstrikes crossed every line. Fort Tiuna serves as Venezuela's military headquarters. the equivalent of striking the Pentagon. La Carlota Air Base houses the country's primary air defense systems. These weren't drug facilities or criminal hideouts. They were core military installations of a sovereign nation. The silence from Venezuelan authorities speaks volumes about the regime's vulnerability. Maduro's government, which typically responds to any perceived slight with inflammatory rhetoric and public demonstrations, has remained conspicuously quiet about direct military attacks on their capital. This suggests either complete surprise or recognition that public acknowledgement would demand retaliation they can't deliver. International law experts note the strikes occurred without UN authorization, congressional approval, or any formal declaration of hostilities. The Trump administration appears to be operating under expanded interpretations of counterterrorism authority, treating drug cartels as unlawful combatants subject to military action anywhere in the world. The escalation timeline reveals a deliberate strategy: build military pressure through incremental steps, maintain legal ambiguity through counter-narcotics justifications, and test Venezuelan responses before committing to direct action. The Caracas strikes represent the culmination of this approach, the moment economic pressure and proxy operations gave way to open military confrontation. The official narrative from Washington centers on dismantling what Secretary of State Marco Rubio calls narco-terrorist networks that pose an imminent threat to American security. The Trump administration presents evidence of cocaine shipments, money laundering operations, and alleged collaboration between Venezuelan officials and criminal organizations. They point to the designation of high-ranking Venezuelan military officers as drug kingpins and the $15 million bounty on Maduro himself for narco-terrorism charges. But examining the actual targets reveals a different story. Fort Tuna isn't a drug processing facility. It's Venezuela's primary military command center, housing the defense ministry and coordinating the country's armed forces. La Carlota Air Base doesn't store cocaine shipments. It operates the radar systems and fighter aircraft that constitute Venezuela's air defense network. These installations represent the backbone of Venezuelan military capability, not criminal infrastructure. The geographic pattern of U.S. operations tells an equally revealing story. While drug trafficking typically flows through remote coastal areas and jungle routes, American strikes have consistently targeted Venezuela's most strategically important locations. The December CIA drone strike hit Puerto Cabello, the country's second-largest port and a crucial oil export terminal. The naval blockade focuses on shipping lanes essential for Venezuela's petroleum industry, not traditional smuggling routes. Historical context exposes the deeper motivations behind current actions. U.S.-Venezuela tensions didn't begin with drug trafficking concerns. They started with Hugo Chávez's 1999 rise to power and his challenge to American influence in Latin America. The Bush administration briefly supported a coup attempt against Chávez in 2002. The Obama administration imposed the first sanctions in 2015. Trump's first term brought recognition of opposition leader Juan Guaidó and attempts to freeze Venezuelan assets worldwide. The pattern mirrors previous U.S. interventions across Latin America, where security justifications masked geopolitical objectives. The 1983 Grenada invasion was framed as protecting American medical students but aimed at removing a leftist government. The 1989 Panama operation claimed to combat drug trafficking while removing Manuel Noriega and securing canal control. The 2019 Bolivia crisis saw U.S. support for regime change following disputed elections, with minimal mention of drugs despite Bolivia being a major coca producer. Trump's own statements reveal the broader agenda. In late December, he declared it would be smart for Maduro to leave power and warned that playing tough would have permanent consequences. These aren't the words of someone focused solely on drug interdiction. They're ultimatums demanding regime change. The timing of military escalation coinciding with Venezuela's upcoming constitutional assembly elections suggests coordination with political pressure. Energy resources provide the ultimate explanation for sustained U.S. interest. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels worth trillions of dollars at current prices. American petroleum companies lost access to these resources following nationalization under Chavez and expanded sanctions under Trump. Military intervention could potentially restore Western corporate access to Venezuelan oil fields through a compliant government. The international law implications are staggering. Striking sovereign territory without UN authorization or congressional approval violates the UN Charter's prohibition on aggressive war. The Trump administration appears to be stretching counterterrorism authorities beyond recognition, treating drug cartels as unlawful combatants subject to military action anywhere globally. Legal experts warn this precedent could justify similar operations against any country harboring criminal organizations. Regional allies' responses illuminate the true nature of these operations. Colombia, traditionally America's closest partner in counter-narcotics efforts, has remained notably silent about the Venezuelan strikes. Brazil's government, despite opposing Maduro, has called for diplomatic solutions rather than military action. Even right-wing governments across Latin America seem uncomfortable with the precedent of U.S. forces conducting unilateral strikes against sovereign nations. The absence of Venezuelan government response reveals regime vulnerability, but also suggests recognition that public acknowledgement would demand retaliation they cannot deliver. Maduro's military, weakened by years of sanctions and brain drain, lacks capability for meaningful response against U.S. forces. This asymmetry enables American escalation while minimizing risks of broader conflict. The drug war justification crumbles under scrutiny when compared to actual trafficking patterns. Most cocaine entering the United States originates in Colombia and transits through Central America or Mexico, not Venezuela. Venezuelan production represents a fraction of regional output, making it an unlikely priority for military intervention based solely on narcotics concerns. The evidence points toward a calculated strategy. Use legitimate counter-narcotics concerns to justify military pressure aimed at regime change and resource control. The drug war provides legal cover for operations that would otherwise constitute acts of war against a sovereign nation. The immediate humanitarian consequences are already unfolding across Caracas. Residents fled to the streets during the bombing, with 21-year-old office worker Carmen Hidalgo describing how the whole ground shook and "we felt like the air was hitting us." Power outages have left entire neighborhoods in darkness, while hospitals struggle to maintain operations amid infrastructure damage. The strikes have displaced thousands of families who now face an uncertain future in a country already grappling with economic collapse. The economic ripple effects extend far beyond Venezuela's borders. Oil markets reacted immediately to news of the strikes, with Brent crude prices jumping 4% in early trading as investors worried about supply disruptions. Venezuela's oil infrastructure, already weakened by years of sanctions and underinvestment, faces further degradation from military action. This affects not just Venezuelan revenue, but regional energy security, particularly for Caribbean nations dependent on Venezuelan petroleum products through preferential trade agreements. Russia and China's response will define the broader geopolitical consequences. Both nations have invested billions in Venezuelan infrastructure and energy projects, viewing Maduro's government as a strategic ally in challenging U.S. hemispheric dominance. Moscow has previously deployed military advisors and advanced weapons systems to Venezuela, while Beijing holds over $60 billion in Venezuelan debt. The strikes represent a direct challenge to their sphere of influence, potentially triggering diplomatic retaliation or even military support for Caracas. Caribbean security dynamics have fundamentally shifted overnight. Smaller nations now face an impossible choice between maintaining traditional neutrality and acknowledging U.S. military supremacy in their region. Trinidad and Tobago's decision to host American forces signals recognition that opposition carries unacceptable risks. Other Caribbean states are quietly reassessing their relationships with Venezuela, understanding that association with Maduro's regime could invite similar pressure. The precedent established by these strikes threatens international law itself. If the United States can justify military action against any nation harboring criminal organizations, the sovereignty of dozens of countries becomes questionable. Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia all host significant drug trafficking operations. Afghanistan, Syria, and numerous African nations contain terrorist groups. The Venezuelan precedent could enable future interventions anywhere American officials claim security threats exist. European allies face their own diplomatic crisis. While generally supporting counter-narcotics efforts, EU nations cannot endorse unilateral military action against sovereign states. The strikes force European governments to choose between Atlantic Alliance solidarity and international law principles, potentially fracturing Western unity on global governance issues. The United Nations Security Council's emergency session, requested by Venezuela and supported by Russia and China, will test institutional responses to American unilateralism. While U.S. veto power prevents formal condemnation, the debate will expose international isolation on these tactics and potentially strengthen alternative diplomatic frameworks led by Beijing and Moscow. Most significantly, these strikes signal Trump's willingness to use military force unilaterally during his second term, establishing expectations for how his administration will handle other international challenges, from Iran to North Korea. The Caracas strikes represent a fundamental shift from economic pressure to direct military action, marking the end of the shadow war and the beginning of open confrontation. The drug war justification cannot mask the deeper objectives: regime change and resource control through force. This escalation sets dangerous precedents for international law and regional stability, while revealing the true scope of American ambitions in Latin America. Subscribe for continued analysis as this crisis reshapes hemispheric power dynamics.